So this aquaponics system is partially shaded by the tree in my backyard. Try to step back, show you. So part of the day it certainly has shade, probably during the most intense time. Right now the water is very low. What happens is occasionally, I think you can see the water level right now. This here is the outlet. Obviously this is the inlet to the grow bed. This is returning to the tank. You see fish food particles hovering around right now. And what I think happens is, since this PVC tube goes directly through the concrete into here, there's just one tube that runs under the soil, or sorry, under the gravel at the length of this, and it's perforated with little holes. Let's see if I can uncover it. So you can see it right there. That's all it is. And I think occasionally a large amount of debris kind of covers up the holes and slows down the flow rate. So usually you won't see this much water in the system. Yeah, there's actually usually not even standing water in the system, but every couple of weeks I'll see this condition where the water rises in here, and that's coming up above. I think the water's probably right about here, which is obviously higher than what it should drain to when this is totally clear and draining. So I think, and usually it clears itself. I don't usually have to do anything. I think as the bacteria builds up, or maybe small bugs and bacteria together eat away at the soft media that's built up and clogged the tube, and then it clears itself up again. So that's pretty cool. It's kind of turns it into a maintenance-free situation. But on the downside, there's a region here where the PVC tube goes out, and there's a steel C-clamp on here. Sorry, a steel band clamp that's just pinching the wall. I don't think I can show it. It's pinching the wall of the silver tarp around the PVC and just clamping it there. So it's not 100% waterproof, but it's waterproof enough that it doesn't leak out any significant amount of water. When it comes to my PVC, I actually don't have any glue on any of my fittings at all, and that has not led to any problems. In fact, it's been really helpful when I had issues and I wanted to take things apart. But you can see here, there's just a little bit of mud. I think that's taking place because slight amount of water leaks out of here continuously. It's a lot less that leaks out when the water level's not high. Yeah, you can see there's a little bit of water against the stone. This stone isn't sealed with any glue or anything. In fact, the wood here is just designed as a bracket to hold the tube. It's not any kind of sealing surface. This brick is turned sideways, so the holes that are in the top and the bottom of this brick are actually facing here. And then I have the board here screwed into a 2x4 section, so it's being pinched and secured to the brick. This is my water refill system. It's ready to be automated. It's a reverse osmosis plus a DI kit. The DI element here is almost probably at the end of its life. Oh, that's not quite true. You see the darker color in the back? That darker color is the area that's been consumed already. The DI system basically takes the water high pressure directly from the hose outlet right here. That's constantly open. And then it comes in and it goes to this solenoid valve. The solenoid valve is just a plain old 120 volts. Right now I'm filling, so it's hooked up with the valve open because I'm supplying power, and then it's just slowly trickling through. You see my white tube is the outlet from the DI system, and the white tube is just trickling in it gets 1 gallon of output in 15 minutes. I've filled this tank probably 10 times already. Obviously partial fills because I never let it go all the way down. And it hasn't slowed down yet. If it slows down, that means the DI filter is probably pretty much used up because it's getting full of material that's slowing down the flow rate. So the big contraption here, the big brown piece, is really just a lid for my to cover up the tank. I keep the lid closed most of the time. It keeps the algae from growing in the water, and based on what I've read, the fish don't need any significant amount of light. In fact, it makes sense because out in the lakes they're hiding down deep underneath brush and in water that's cooler than the water up near the surface where you actually will get light. So the fish are pretty happy. Right now I have crappie, I have perch, and there are 7 of them. Maybe I can get an underwater video later, but that's the perch. They're pretty active. They don't, their eating pattern is not what I expected, because I'll give the same amount of food every single day, but on some days they come gobble it up very quickly, and on other days it just floats there. And I'm hoping that they eat it before it turns to mush and goes through my pump. This pump here is 20 watts. It's off the shelf. It's running 24 hours, and it's been quiet. It's been maintenance free for me. I think I've removed this cover here. Sorry. I removed this cover once. I cleaned the sponge that acts as sort of a filter for large solids, and then I actually removed the sponge altogether because, well, I wanted to see if it wasn't necessary. It was slowing down the flow rate, and the flow rate slowing wasn't a problem because I actually have this pump throttled at about 50%. There's a little dial down there. It's concealed right now. You can't see it, but it basically just throttles the inlet to slow down the pump rate. When you adjust most of these pumps, you might be thinking that you're slowing down the electrical consumption of the motor or you're changing the inlet voltage, but you're not. You're just basically reducing the orifice that lets the water pass through. So anyway, this one's been running for multiple months now without that filter, and the good thing is now I have a consistent flow rate. So my problem wasn't that it was slowing down. I could always open up the orifice, but rather the problem was, I'd get it tuned in to where it's the flow rate I want, and then I'd come out in 3 weeks and it'd be slower and trickling, and I'd have to adjust it. So now I don't have to do that. The pipe comes up and it goes into, I guess, the midway point of this barrel. I think this is a 20-gallon barrel. It's lasted ever since I set up the system. Maybe a month after I set up the system, I installed the barrel. So maybe February it went in. February the system went in. March the barrel went in. And I've probably cleaned this swirl filter only 3 times. The cleaning process is really simple. Down there, I've got the bucket sitting on top, half a bucket, and that's because I threaded my PVC outlet to the bottom, clamped it with the rubber washer, and that keeps it leak free. And then I just have this valve to drain it. And then you'll see on the inside the debris is mostly settled at the bottom, and yeah, you can see it there. And if I wanted to clean this filter, which I've chosen just to leave it most of the time and see what happens, the result was it was fine. But if I want to clean it, then I'll just swish around the debris, get it off of the bottom, and then open this valve and just start dumping it out. And I'll do it now just to show what it looks like. I'm not going to switch this around because I don't want to disturb the other water right now. So this goes pretty quickly, and then it's going to, you'll see this water stop flowing for a bit because the water level lowers. Some people have this outlet here, this inlet to the swirl filter up higher. I don't really like that. It was just my feeling that I'd like to put it right here when I built the filter, and I've been happy with that. And the reason is, if I turn off the water, if I turn off the pump, then the water will drain from here down to that level, and then it quits draining, so I still have access to the old muddy water if I want to get rid of that. The other reason I like it being at this level is that there's a longer path for the water, any solids and debris, to go swirling. If they wanted to come up towards this outlet, then it's a longer path than if I just had it right here. I think when it's up at the top, it makes the water too high of velocity when it's moving for the swirl filter to allow the solids to settle quite as much. That may be a small impact, I'm not sure. But I basically just keep this cap on here to keep down on algae. And the swirl filter, I'm assuming the solids haven't built up that much because bacteria are breaking down the solids and turning them into kind of liquids. That's the only hypothesis I have, because I know trees drop little bits of leaves in here. Sometimes the fish don't eat all the food. Sometimes my plants are dropping particles down into this water, and I know that it may be accumulating to some degree in the media down below, but it's not continuing to build up, because otherwise I would most certainly have clogs, or I would have very murky water in the tank, which I don't have. So this has all been just really pleasant surprises. You'll see an air stone in there right now. Haven't been using it. This is just another experiment I've been doing to say, well, what's the minimum that I can get away with and have the system sustain itself? And the fish haven't shown any sign of illness or problems. I'm hoping that I have enough water movement with these 6 streams splashing back into the bottom and then trickling across all the media, and hopefully that's bringing some aeration. And I don't have a high stocking density from what I understand other people do. So here in this cable rack, which, well, I've got the clean water going in, I've got the air going in if I want it, I've got the power going to my pump, and I have a temperature sensor that's connected to Wi-Fi, and I'm monitoring that. I had a variety of other sensors, but other projects kept me from really tuning that system, making it consistent and making it give data throughout the whole season. So I really like this material. That I found it on eBay, but you can only buy large amounts of it. But it's totally weatherproof, so it doesn't keep rain out, but the rain and the sun don't hurt it. So that's nice. It keeps things looking neat. I'll explain a little bit about my overflow system. So if I squat down, you can see the height of the swirl filter outlet is just a few inches taller than the height of my overflow outlet here. And so that guarantees that, well, first, the most important thing is that the height of this brings with gravity enough water pressure for these 6 tubes to emit enough water. And they're black and solid PVC. That's important because algae does want to build up in here, and you can see it on the tip of each one of these. I've had 1 to 2 occasions in the summer where I had to clean them with like a little pipe cleaner or something. And once again, these are not glued. This is just a hole that I drilled with a regular drill. I measured the diameter of this, can't remember, it's a 1/4 inch outlet, 3/8 inch, sorry, 1/4 inch inner diameter, 3/8 inch outer diameter tube. I just drilled a hole in the PVC, slightly smaller, and jammed it in there, just kind of twist and press, and it works. There's no special feature about this PVC pipe right here. So let me tell you what happens if you don't have this overflow. If you just cap it, then your flow rate out needs to be equal to the flow rate in. And if the pressure from this height isn't exactly the right amount to flow out at the same rate that it's flowing in, then you'll have a situation where the water level, let's say the pressure is not high enough to drive all the water out of these then your water level would be rising inside the bucket. And then it's going to rise higher than where I want it, which is just trickling over the top. See, it's just pouring in. You want that kind of situation, because then you know you have a little buffer between accidentally overflowing your tank, your swirl filter, and running low on water out of your swirl filter, which would mean in this situation, in this setup, that would mean starving the plants of water. I think the longest I've ever gone without giving water to the plants is about 24 hours. There's almost never been a hiccup. I think the 24 hours was intentional. It was a rainy day, so maybe that's not a fair judgment, but I think this is pretty resilient system against if you have a problem and you lose water. So the pressure in here in this height drives the flow rate out of here, but then the orifice size changes and the friction changes when you get algae buildup. So that's not enough. And what I wanted to do is just make sure that pressure is more than I needed to give full flow rate here, and then whatever's extra is just going to flow here. And if I drive this height up at this outlet, then this flow rate's just going to increase a little. These flow rates will slightly increase, but not by much, and everything just maintains balance. It's very it's easy to see everything going on in the components. So if you have a problem, it's easy to identify, and it's also very maintenance free. I'll talk a little bit about my baskets. These baskets are designed to go in 5-gallon buckets, and I think some people do the Dutch bucket system or other 5-gallon bucket container systems with this. You can see they're just regular mesh, and I decided I would go ahead and try 6 individual plants with 6 individual buckets. Right now this has been changed over because I had a tomato plant that died, or a pepper plant that wouldn't grow. So this lettuce it's been in here for about 1 week. It finally got their roots established, and they also they started out just slightly smaller than they are now, but they're a lot more perky, so that tells me the roots are getting established. I still hesitate to say this system would be any good for leafy greens, because the root systems seem to be smaller and less, they can't reach very well from the left side of the basket to the middle of the basket, in the event that this water is only dropping in the middle of the basket. So really, I think this system makes more sense to be used with fruiting plants like tomatoes. Now, currently my tomatoes are all out of order. They haven't been given the care that they should be given to look nice, but also they've grown so tall that I've cut them at the tops multiple times, and they grow back with 2 or 3 branches every time I cut a branch. Now, if you're a gardener or you're savvy in plants in general, then you probably already knew that would happen, but I didn't know that's how it worked. And so what I tried to do is something I saw from a video, which is in the case of this plant, okay, lop off all the old non-fruiting branches like these, and let this branch drop down and start a coil, but it's just too stiff to even drop down on the floor. So if anyone can figure out and tell me how to have this lower itself to the ground so I can have the fruiting branches up in the air, that would be great. You know, but my system, when I trimmed it and restrung the string, it did look a heck of a lot better than this. That's not the best I can do, for sure. You probably noticed this plant's supposed to be down here. And so you can see there's actually, I can flex this a little bit without it coming out, but I wouldn't tug on it because then it's just going to pop right out. And then I aim the water just wherever. I kind of get it centralized, but I don't know if it's bad to have water directly spewing onto that trunk, but sometimes it does. Sometimes I just leave things up to chance, but I make the observation so I can find out later if it's actually a problem or if it's just an OCD thing that would keep you from allowing it to go its way. This here is the bell pepper that took way too long to grow. There's 3 significant size for me, because I had several bell peppers this year. It's my first year that came out the size of my thumb and were no good, and then my chickens ate half the leaves off the plants, and then the plants, when the peppers did get a little bigger, then they just fell over. But in this case, this average health, not great. You can see the veins, which means some sort of deficiency. Earlier in the season, I was more studious about checking the conditions and trying to countermeasure them, but later my plate just got too full. So when I added iron, and I added Biomin iron to my water, and I also added CalMag. Problem is, I did it in the same day, and it did improve the condition of a lot of these leaves, and that improvement maintained itself for maybe 2 weeks. Now that I think they're on the decline again. My string system goes like this. When I planted the plant, I tied it off at the bottom, and then I just have this cotton string, which it looks like a vine now, it's so dirty, but the cotton string goes up to here, and it's just tied with a simple loop. I can remove it by pulling this. This is quite taut, this line, which goes from the right side over here to a metal eyelet to the other side, and I tightened that up as much as I could just by hand and tied my knots, and then I made my string go directly up to here, and as the plant grew, I just trellised it around in this manner. You'll also notice that I'm using 2 kinds of media. This is the, and now I'm forgetting the name, expanded clay pellets. I enjoy them. I think they look nicer. I like that they're lightweight even when they have water in them. So they're easier to move around. And then there's this expanded shale, which is supposed to be cheap. It's supposed to be easy to find, but if you live in a small city and they just don't happen to have it at the landscaping store, then you can end up paying, like, for this amount times 5, you'll pay like $40 to get it shipped, or to have to buy smaller packages at Home Depot or something. So that was the one part of my system that was kind of expensive, and there was nothing I could do about it. Is finding the right media, because this was the same. This one is only sold in kind of specialized packages. You get it at hydroponics stores or whatever. Also had to go to Houston to get those. I could have got a truckload of this from Austin for a real good deal, like $100, but of course that was not gonna work for me. And then in the bottom, it's neither of the two. In the bottom here, oh boy, that's just regular old pea gravel. I think they call it 1/4 inch or 3/8. Obviously, that's an average kind of figure. It's not. It's the same stuff I've got sitting around underneath the stones. When I built these stones, they're not cemented, they're not glued or anything like that. They're just sitting on top of what's mostly clay. I dug it out so it was level, and then I added a layer of this pea gravel so I could manually rake it level before I started laying my blocks. And you can see now over one spring, one summer, and a heck of a lot of rain. Now this, since it's higher than the level of the yard, it did start to tilt down, and those gaps in those bricks, those didn't used to be there. So this would not be a 10-year system, probably wouldn't even be a 5-year system. It was, for me, an experimental system. The neat feature I like is that I put this fishnet up here. These shower curtain dealies that I bought at the dollar store for, what do you know, $1.25, because that's what the dollar store is these days. On the bottom, to keep it taut, see, this stuff gets hung up a little bit on the splinters, but it never stays hung up, and it doesn't rip, so that was a good thing to learn. On the bottom I used this line that had fishing weights already on it. Actually, when I was fishing at the local lake, there was somebody that just left this garbage on the ground. It was it was these weights on an actual fishing net, but the fishing net was all torn up and no good anymore. So I cut that up. I'm resourceful and I like to save money, but actually that's not my style to use trash that I found, and the reason is I can't help other people to do the same system as me if I'm going and getting trash that other people can't find. So I'd much rather use low cost, off the shelf items. Which brings me to another topic. These railroad ties, or I think they're sold as landscape timbers, 8 feet each originally, and of course I cut the vertical ones. Those were only $1.75-ish or $2.25 at Home Depot. Later in the season I saw them for only $1 at Walmart. They worked great. It's funny because on the tag they say not for structural use, which I think is just a CYA kind of statement. They don't want you to build your deck out of this and start walking around on it, because they can split. They're not high quality pieces of timber, but for this purpose obviously it's fine. And I just used these maybe it's smaller than 3/8 or near 3/8 inch plywood, and I just cut these triangles and screwed them all together. Definitely had to put them on the top too. These joints are not stable by nature because of the roundness of the beams, and these you've got gaps everywhere, so you really have to reinforce it. If you don't reinforce it, then you haven't even really assembled anything with integrity at all. Shout out to my buddy Herbert for helping me to cut and screw and hold up and build this whole structure. The idea here, once again, with other parts of the system, is that I wanted to be able to just rip it apart and transport it to a new location, or even expand it if that's what I chose to do, because I knew this is my first year and it wouldn't be perfect, and it would need to be changed down the road. A little bit of note about the plants themselves. This whole thing started out with a highly controlled experiment. I planted each one of these types of tomatoes that I have here, which is only 2 right now. I planted in soil over here in these grow bags. The grow bags look like this. They're porous fabric material, pretty tough. Only retains as much moisture as the mass of dirt that you have in it. That's one of the lessons learned, because in hot Texas these things evaporate off the walls quickly. But if you keep them frequently watered, frequent in small amounts, then they do an amazing thing called air pruning. I'm getting a little off topic, but to summarize air pruning, it seems that the roots can detect that they've reached the wall, because they can detect either the oxygen or the lower amounts of moisture on the edges, and the roots don't continue to try to grow, and they don't swirl around like they do in solid pots and bind themselves up, and the roots grow more in the central area and become more efficient at picking up nutrients. All that's just to say that I planted the same tomatoes, the cherry tomatoes, as well as another kind of typical size variety here in this system, as well as in the grow bags. And this system, the plants grew faster. The leaves became larger, which is indicative of high nitrogen. These leaves aren't that large, but the ones I had earlier in the season were huge. But then the fruit was kind of equivalent and disappointing on both accounts. It was disappointing in the grow bags and it was disappointing here. That I contribute to my my just general poor gardening skills and not really understanding how much light is too much light, how much nutrients are enough nutrients, and how frequently watering needs to happen. You think you can judge just by touching the soil, but experience goes a long way. After adding the Biomin iron and the CalMag, these flowers that I used to get tons and tons of flowers and no fruit, a lot of the flowers would just drop off or disappear, or I thought they were making fruit. I thought they had turned to a little tiny fruit, and then it was just gone. And after I added the supplements, I got far more fruit. And this is something that I wish I had done earlier in the season when the plants were actually in order. I was chasing away pests if necessary, and I was pruning so that most of this growth was fruit centric instead of just foliage everywhere and foliage popping out of the top of this thing. Little note about the top of the structure is that I had introduced midway through the summer when the heat was really intense. I put some shade cloth on the top. It was about 40% shade cloth. Made a really big impact on the plants, that they were kind of shriveling. They were kind of just not growing very fast. There was no browning, but after I put the shade cloth, they started accelerating their growth again. And one pleasant note is that the plants here in the middle of the heat actually still looked very green and very healthy, other than the fact that they weren't fruiting and they weren't growing that fast. And I attribute that to having loads and loads of water all the time. They had as much as they needed, and that is something worth repeating. I'll share a little embarrassing story about the semi-submerged tank. As you can see, this 100-gallon tank is maybe 2/3 to 3/4 underneath the ground, just by digging a hole and sticking it in there and then filling in the rest with loose gravel and dirt. But it had a problem during a big, huge rain. It was coupled with a situation where the water wasn't draining down through this tube very well, and so I had a low amount of water in the tank. And what happened was a ton of water went up underneath the tank in the ground and made the tank float. And it pushed those PVC tubes all the wrong way. One of them came loose partially. I lost most of my water, and the tank itself was like almost completely out of the ground. So very bad. But the fish still had, you know, at least 10 gallons of water remaining, and they were totally okay, but kind of frantic. The behavior was weird that day. It's sort of happening again, and I'm not sure which part leaked, but you can see the water here. This is the one single biggest trouble of this system, is that you gotta either anchor your system or just make dang sure that you don't have space for water to go down there. You gotta fill in the dirt, fill it in well, and not just wait for dirt to wash its way in there. So that was my fault for not actively packing the dirt around the system. I guess we can take a little look at some of the roots right now. So well, look at this tomato. It's so tall, it's coming out of the top, and then for scale, we'll look down here and I'll scoop up some of these roots. You know, I might not be able to get them all out of the rocks down there. Yeah, I can. That's really all they've got. Might have been more before I handled this bucket earlier today. But I have a feeling that if I cut these roots off that were dangling down below the buckets, here's the pepper. I have a feeling that if I cut these roots, the plant would be perfectly fine and grow them back quite quickly. The feeling I have that is because I've accidentally cut some of the roots before or severed them, and also because the plants became fairly large, almost to this biomass, before the roots even touched the bottom of this media. They were dangling below the pot, but they weren't all the way into the media down here. So that's just to give an idea of how much root it takes to support the plant of this size. I'm just going to come over here and give a view of the back side of the system. I've got my Malabar spinach here. It's doing kind of looking ugly right now. It's in its grow bag, but it's hanging up to the top. That's one neat thing about I'm glad I left these wooden beams hanging so I could add plants like this just for fun. Right here is actually the drainage of the drain for the DI system. So for every gallon it produces of clean water, it dumps off about 2 gallons of dirty water. Actually not exactly sure how that works, but it's definitely dirty. I've tested it for total dissolved solids, and it has up in the several hundreds, maybe above 500, and the total dissolved solids coming right out of the DI system I've found is in the 10s or 20s. It's great. It's really doing its job, and it was just a $60 system from Amazon. Oh, what I was going to mention about this thing was that on the day of my flood catastrophe, we had the heavy rains, and then we also had this this tube was not located so far down. It was on the same elevation as the whole system, and so a lot of that water was able to make its way backwards into the hole and blow that tank right up out of the ground. So that was a lesson learned, and that's why my tube is all the way down here, down the hill now.